last few years have seen renewed interest in open tabletop-style Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, commonly referred to as the West March campaign. This style of game gets its origins from Dungeons & Dragons' very beginning with wargaming clubs that the game's creators Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax belonged to. Designing dungeons for this style of campaign varies significantly from how it's commonly done with modern iterations of the game, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, coming up next on RPG Retro Reviews. Hello everyone, I'm Captain Courageous and I review old school modules and games and try to give them a fun and informative analysis. If you've ever had your brand new D&D character fall into a pit and die 5 minutes after you created them, shelves full of games you'll probably never play, or enjoy tormenting your players with devious tricks and traps in vast labyrinthine underground complexes, this channel's for you. Welcome, adventurer. This week I'm taking a quick break from module reviews to talk about dungeon design, specifically in the old school style as described in the original D&D 3rd booklet, Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. But first, a big shout out and thank you to Black Spire Fantasy for sponsoring this video. Are you interested in the style of old school role-playing games but would prefer the integration of a few modern mechanics into your system? Do you enjoy the works of Robert E. Howard, Carl Edward Wagner, and other authors of the pulp fantasy genre? If so, there's a new tabletop role-playing game on the horizon, Swords and Chaos, an RPG game that weds old school and new school design to produce a pulse-pounding sword and sorcery experience that is finely crafted to emulate the feeling of a classic tale straight from the pulps. Play larger-than-life characters in a grim and wicked age. Swords and Chaos is powered by the Siege engine of Trollord Games, so if you are familiar with the OSR, Castles and Crusades, or even 5th edition, you will be able to dive right in with ease. Check out Black Spire Fantasy's Kickstarter right now. What are you waiting for? Pledge your allegiance to Swords and Chaos. This video was inspired by several other videos I've watched recently. Ben Milton over at Questing Beast has two great videos, The Lost Dungeon Crawling Rules of D&D and The Lost Key to Understanding Old School D&D. Professor Dungeon Master over at Dungeon Craft also released a video, Gygax's Lost Campaign Rules, which details what has in the last few years become referred to as a West March campaign, an open tabletop style of play created by Ben Robbins and popularized by one of Matt Colville's videos a few years ago. The West March style campaign is an open sandbox concept where a large pool of players decide when game sessions will be scheduled and what area of the DM setting will be explored, what rumors they want to investigate, and so on. This style of play comes from the very origins of the game. In original D&D, when the rules said the game was from 4 to 50 players, this is the kind of game Gary Gygax was referring to. A hallmark of this kind of play was, of course, the dungeon, usually a vast, dangerous underground complex populated with a variety of tricks, traps, monsters, strange and bizarre encounters. Generally, old-school dungeons were ever-expanding, ever-increasing in size, with many levels and sub-levels going off in various directions. How exactly, then, did a dungeon master go about creating such a monstrosity? Note that this sort of dungeon design has fallen out of favor in recent iterations of the game, with many preferring a more logical ecology over gonzo randomness, but personally I love funhouse dungeons, and if you've never had the opportunity to play this way, this video can help you reconstruct the method or even revisit this old school style. While the original D&D booklets are expensive to acquire in physical form these days, you can get them very inexpensively at Drive-Thru RPG. The original box set came with 3 little brown booklets, Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasure, and Underground and Wilderness Adventures. For this video, we're going to take a look specifically at the 3rd book, Underground and Wilderness Adventures, and see what tips it gives for dungeon design. Note that in original D&D, the underground realm was referred to as the Underworld. Later editions would retcon this to be called the Underdark, so if you are familiar with this terminology, just know they are essentially interchangeable. I'm also going to revisit some original D&D products that were released to help facilitate this style of dungeon design. As we open up the third booklet, Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, the first thing a prospective referee is presented with is a cross-section map of the dungeon, and note that the term Dungeon Master is not used in these books. The official adoption of that term was still a few years away. The book instructs the referee to create a cross-section of their underground labyrinth to get an idea of how all the pieces fit together. The levels don't necessarily have to be stacked one on top of the other, but go off in different tangents with sub-levels and such. Each level having various means of egress, from slanting passages, many stairways, and even magical teleports. The cross-section diagram would be a staple of early examples of dungeon construction, but isn't usually seen in modern D&D, but is an extremely handy tool as its visualization can allow the DM to decide where the various pieces connect and fit together. It is also suggested that the referee design the first 3 levels all at once before play begins, though each level does not necessarily have to be complete. Different hallway sections can sprawl off in all directions, with the unfinished sections perhaps collapse and require the players to dig it out to find out what lies beyond. Of course, by the time the party has gathered the resources and manpower for such a project, the DM has had time to finish that section of the dungeon. Thus, it was expected a level to expand out to encompass the entire sheet of graph paper, and you see this kind of thing is prevalent in old school dungeon design for this reason. When running a West Marches campaign and the various groups are going through such a thing, each party can affect what the other discovers. If one party gets to the treasure first, then the party that comes behind them will only find an empty treasure chest. Note also that since the dungeon sprawls in all directions, the path each group takes will differ. Later on down the road, it can be quite beneficial for the differing groups to gather at the tavern, so to speak, and compare their maps and get a better picture of what's there and what they might have missed, such as secret doors and the like. Of course, one of the hallmarks of this kind of play is resource management, keeping track of not only what the characters are carrying, their encumbrance, but also how much longer their torches will burn, and even how much food they have. Various dungeon features could throw a party off, and even with careful mapping, they may find themselves trapped in the dungeon with no known way out. Shifting walls or rotating corridors that close off previously unexplored passages, trapdoors that don't lead to pits but actually dump characters on the next level or even 2 levels down, which is why a cross-section of the dungeon is so handy, as it can provide an idea of where such features should be placed. Also, teleports that transport characters or the entire party unintentionally to the lower levels of the dungeon are examples of the many ways a party can become lost or trapped in a dungeon. The Underworld and Wilderness Adventures booklet provides a sample dungeon, so let's take a look at the various examples that are suggested here. As we take a look at the map, the stairs down, 1 leads through a blind passage to a circular room with wedge-shaped divisions. Unless the party finds the secret door, they literally will just go around in circles. Section 2 is a room labyrinth leading nowhere, but ultimately to Area A, which contains a monster, possibly 4 ogres, and 2,000 gold pieces in treasure and a magic potion of some type. Section 3 demonstrates the use of odd-angled passages to throw off map makers. Room and passage descriptions usually entail the DM saying something to the effect: you see a long passage 40 feet in length and 10 feet in width. At the 40-foot mark, there is an intersecting passage running east to west. The passages then continue on northward 20 feet and ends at the door. The 10-foot squares were there to facilitate ease of map making when describing things on graph paper. Thus, obviously, giving the right-angle squares on graph paper, odd-angle passages are a bit harder to map accurately. Section 4 deceptively leads to a monster in Area B, but Area C is really mean. It appears to be stairs leading upwards, but is actually a sliding stair trap that leads to a lower level of the dungeon. Section 5 is a fun demonstration of transporter use as mentioned earlier. The passage at D slants so gradually that dwarves may not realize it, that leads to a lower level of the dungeon. The room E is a two-way transporter that can lead anywhere the DM likes, another dimension, the moon. The limits are only your imagination. And Area F is a one-way teleporter that transports an entire party to another level to a similar passage that, unless they backtrack, they may not realize it until their map conflicts with previously drawn passages. Section 6 demonstrates what a shifting wall section might look like and how its movement can block access to previously traversed areas. The trapdoor might lead to a lower level of the dungeon, and the shifting passage might leave the party with no other choice but to move to a lower level. This can be pretty bad if torch supply or food is running low or the party is badly wounded. Section 7 demonstrates a nexus point that might throw off mappers who are expecting to emerge in one direction but due to the room's rotation emerge elsewhere. Section 8 leads to several encounters, possibly a monster, possibly an evil NPC. Note the secret doors to allow for a handy escape for the villain, if needs be. It's important to clarify that moving to a lower level was always a more dangerous affair. The traps more deadly, the monsters tougher, so moving to a lower level while low on supplies, with injured party members and such, is especially dangerous. On the next page, the booklet describes several interesting tricks and traps a referee might spring on their players. Such things as sinking rooms that slowly sink to a lower level, or rooms that only appear to sink, all while the doors are stuck shut for several turns. Doors that only open one way or appear and disappear at random intervals. Cavern passages with widely varying widths, further frustrating accurate map making, and of course, spatially distorting rooms and corridors which appear longer or shorter than they actually are. Note that a dungeon typically has more uninhabited spaces than occupied spaces, and the booklet details what would be considered the appropriate distribution of monsters and treasure based on dungeon level. Given the above suggestions and examples on dungeon design, TSR came out with a series of products to help DMs quickly design various levels. The first was Dungeon Geomorphs. This was a big seller for TSR, primarily due to multiple sets being purchased and repeat business. Released in 1976, when photocopiers were not yet so ubiquitous, or copies were expensive, sometimes 25 cents a piece, and only in black and white, and let's not forget that quality wasn't always there either, they allowed a referee to quickly put together a dungeon level map, frequently by cutting apart the various pieces and then taping them together to create an endless number of designs. To populate the many rooms, TSR also produced the Monster and Treasure Assortment, which came with random tables for treasure placement and 100 prepared encounters per level. That's a total of 300 encounters. These were all labeled for the dungeon level they were supposed to represent, thus allowing the DM to construct level-appropriate scenarios quickly and on the fly. If you play a modern OSR like Old School Essentials, Labyrinth Lord, or Swords and Wizardry, you'll find that this supplement is 100% compatible with them. Note that the first release of the Homes version of Dungeons & Dragons Basic came with these two accessories rather than an actual adventure module. Note that dungeon ecology plays an important role in dungeon design. Things like carrion crawlers and gelatinous cubes are great examples of monsters that take advantage of dungeon features. Wild animals, humanoids, evil wizards, and the like frequently take up residence in the abandoned areas of the dungeon. Areas that have been cleared out are later repopulated by other things moving in. Thus, old school dungeons have a dynamic, ever-changing ecosystem. This is addressed on page 8 of Underworld and Wilderness Adventures in the section Maintaining Freshness. Some suggestions here also include making alterations to existing passages by erasing them and redrawing them, extending the boundaries of the map if not already filled to the edges of the graph paper, reversing directions of the map, but relocating the means of egress to lower levels so they still correspond to established dimensions, and splitting a section off so it leads to a previously unknown sublevel. Thus, even previously explored areas of the dungeon can become new and interesting. Note that doors that were open usually closed on their own. Stuck doors for the party usually opened just fine for the monsters, and monsters usually didn't have to worry about springing traps, though certainly a DM could eschew this kind of thing for more logical dungeon design elements. The scale for early dungeon design was 1 square equals 10 feet, and 1 inch is equivalent to 1 inch on the tabletop when employing miniatures. That scale changed to 1 inch equals 10 yards outdoors. Note that tactical use of miniatures on the table with dynamic battle grids like we see today isn't exactly how miniatures were employed then. Miniatures were used to keep track of a party's marching order, where they were when opening doors, and the like. This was especially important for large groups. It was assumed that adventurers would employ henchmen, mercenaries, and hirelings to carry treasure, hold torches, and so on. This scale made it easy to access spell ranges and area of effects on graph paper maps, the range for missile fire, and so forth. So with all of that said, it is important to note that such a thing was also dynamic because there were large groups exploring it, not necessarily all at once. Dungeons in this style are literally a club project, with players gathering at different times during the weeks as scheduling allowed, as per the West March style. Rumors and legends about the dungeon might be uncovered by consulting sages in town. Various sections of the map might be shared between different groups. Rivalries might develop as one group uncovers a coveted and legendary magic item, while another who was questing for the same misses out. Various NPC villains and notorious criminals might emerge, and with so many players interacting with the thing, each adding their own ideas and creativity to the mix, new players coming to the club and joining in, it is easy to see why such things frequently went on for years. Hand-drawn dungeon maps can take a lot of time. Fortunately for us in 2022, there are a lot of great resources where you can freely download old-school dungeon maps for use for this kind of dungeon design. My personal 2 favorites are Paratime Designs, who uploads new maps on a weekly basis, and there is years of free content you can readily download or for just a few dollars. And of course, Dyson's Dodecahedron Map Archive from outstanding map creator Dyson Logos. Links for both of those are in the description. Well, that's about all I have for you today. I hope you found this look back at old school dungeon design fun and interesting. Coming up, I still have my review of L3 Deep Dwarven Delve and a host of fun new content for you. Also, I had the privilege to do a sit-down with Ben Milton of Questing Beast as part of his Ask Dungeon Master series, along with Bud from Bud's RPG Review. Thanks, guys. That was a lot of fun. This video is now live on Ben's channel. A link for it is in the description. Of course, let me thank my patrons who make these videos possible. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. Please give this video a like, comment below, and share. And check out my Teespring store for great gaming swag and t-shirts. Get into my RPG Retro Review community on Facebook and at me on Twitter. And of course, maybe become a patron yourself, or alternatively, you can just send a tip through my PayPal tip jar. And as always, my friends, may your D20 roll true and game on.